Good morning. We have been in a season of talking about what it means to be the church. And this message was one that was planned with a lot of prayer and with a lot of tears. Now, this is one that if you have kids with you in the room, this would be a good time to pause the video and get them set up with a snack and a movie or something. There's some content in this message that's for a more mature audience. So if that's you and your situation right now, go ahead and pause right now and get your kids settled, and we'll jump in. I remember when I was young, there was a shooting at a school called Columbine in Littleton, Colorado. So it was on April 20th of 1999. And there was a girl who was confronted by a shooter. And he asked her, "Do you believe in God?" She said, "Yes, I believe in God." And she was killed on the spot. Jesus' disciples, who said they would die for Jesus, many of them throughout the Gospels said, "Jesus, we would die for you." We've, in this last season as a church, we've followed their journey, looked how many of them for a season ran when things got hard, right? But then after Pentecost, things changed. After Jesus sent his Spirit into his believers and empowered them, they were given new boldness, new clarity. And these men ended up taking the gospel through the known world, along with the disciples that they made. And every one of them, except one of Jesus's apostles, died for their faith. Some of them had run once at Jesus's crucifixion, but they would never run again. John 15:18 through 21 says, "If the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belonged to it." And don't we long for that sometimes, church? To be able to follow Christ and yet to be embraced by the world around us, to have the approval of people around us. But you are no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you. Do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Since they persecuted me, naturally, they will persecute you. And if they had listened to me, they would listen to you. They will do all this to you because of me, for they have rejected the one who sent me. John 15, verse 12 through 17. "This is my commandment, love each other in the same way I have loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you slaves because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. Now you are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father told me. You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. This is my command. Love each other. Church, we are called to bold love. We are called to love God and to love each other the way that Christ loved the church. And what did he do for his church? He laid down his life. And we see this as we study the book of Acts. We see this, the first disciple to die for his faith was Stephen. And Ian talked about him near the beginning of this series, but Stephen was stoned for being bold and committed to his faith, for preaching the truth. He was stoned. Thomas, one of Jesus's disciples, he ended up after Jesus's resurrection, after the church was started, Thomas ended up going to India and to North Africa. The disciples split up and took the gospel throughout the known world, and Thomas went to India and North Africa. And there they worshiped an image of the sun, and he destroyed that image of the sun that they worshiped. In a certain city in India called Kalamina, the sun god's priests, in response, tortured him with red hot metal plates and threw him into a furnace. He stood alive in the fire, unharmed. And the priests were so angry that the fire didn't harm him that they threw spears and javelins at him in the fire. And just as he had once touched Jesus's side and felt the pierce in his side was pierced by a spear, and he died and was reunited with Jesus. Philip took the gospel to Samaria and then to Turkey and Syria. And in AD 51, he was martyred for his faith. James was beheaded by order of King Agrippa himself. And the amazing part of his story is there was a man who was his accuser that brought him before King Agrippa for preaching the gospel. And his accuser was so inspired and convicted by James's joy and peace in the midst of that he came to faith and told James that he would not let him enter martyrdom alone, and went with him to be beheaded for his faith. Bartholomew preached Christ for 37 years. He started in Turkey and traveled to India. There he learned the language in India and translated the Gospel of Matthew into the native language. And then he went on to Armenia, and there he shared the gospel with part of the king's family, and part of the king's family was converted. And they were saved, and the king was so angry, thinking that he had corrupted his family, and he tried to get him to bow down to their idols, to worship their false gods. And when he refused to bow down to their false god and recant, the king of Armenia ordered severe torture. Bartholomew was beaten, crucified upside down, and then skinned. And while still conscious in the midst of this, he continued to preach the gospel to onlookers until he was beheaded, because that was the only thing that could stop his preaching. And in that moment, he was reunited with his Savior. After Matthew wrote the gospel in Hebrew in Jerusalem, he carried the gospel to Ethiopia. After Ethiopia's king died, who was friendly to Christianity at first, a new heathen king took the throne, and he had Matthew dragged from teaching in his church to be nailed to the ground with spears, and he was beheaded in 66 AD. Jude, also called Thaddeus, who was the brother of James and also Jesus's younger brother, he wrote the book of Jude. He took the gospel to Mesopotamia, Syria, Arabia, and Persia, or modern day Iran. He taught with boldness against worshiping idols and was beaten to death by the pagan priests who were making money off of idol worship. Simon Peter, he took the gospel to Egypt, North Africa, Mauritania, and even the islands of Great Britain. Simon was crucified upside down because he didn't count himself worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. And we know that from church tradition that the story of Simon cheering on his wife to stand firm in her faith and be courageous as he watched his wife be led away to be killed for her faith. Andrew, Peter's brother, hung on a cross for 3 days preaching the gospel with joy that he was to be united with Christ. James, one of Jesus's younger brothers, who doubted Jesus during his lifetime, but went on to believe, to write the book of James, and to be a key leader in the church of Jerusalem, was pushed from the top of the temple when he refused to recant his teachings of Jesus. And amazingly, the fall didn't kill him, but it broke his legs. And he kneeled on his broken legs and continued to pray with joy. And while the crowd stood around fighting about stoning him, he was killed with a blow to the head. John was the only one of Jesus's disciples to die a natural death, but it's because they couldn't kill him. The emperor wanted to kill John so thoroughly that he was like, sometimes the Christians aren't burned by the fire, and sometimes they aren't killed by the lions. We need to make sure that he is killed. And he ordered a vat of hot oil to be heated to boiling, and John was thrown in. And the crowd watched as John stood there, unharmed by the oil, and began to worship Jesus in front of the crowd for delivering him. Because the execution failed, the emperor exiled him on the island of Patmos. And it was there that he wrote the book of Revelation. And he died at an old age. Hebrews 11:32-38. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth, of whom the world was not worthy. This is our heritage. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, we may not be given the choice between physical life and death, but we may. But either way, we are called to die. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. Romans 12, 1 and 2. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world. You're not of this world, church. But let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn how to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. What do you need to sacrifice to follow Jesus? Is there anything more important than him? Does anything keep you from being all in, like your brothers and sisters who have gone before you? Is man's approval that valuable? Are the comforts of this world that value? Is any earthly relationship that valuable? Is having your own way, your own control in this life that valuable? Jesus is worth giving everything. Is there anything else worthy of your very life, of living your one life for? I can tell you that your job's not, your hobby's not, your freedom to spend your time how you want is not, your comfort zone is not, having people like you is not. We just talked about how if we follow Jesus, this world is going to hate us because we're not of this world. I remember when I was young, after that shooting in Littleton, Colorado, I remember being at church and a Sunday school teacher, and I don't even remember which one, but I remember being struck when a Sunday school teacher asked us the question, said, what would you do if you were in that situation? If someone walked in here right now and pointed a gun at your head and said, do you believe in God? And I remember that this teacher said, I don't know. I don't know what I would do. And I don't think anyone can know until they're in that situation for themselves. I'd like to think that I would say I did, but I honestly don't know. And I remember being stunned by his answer. Because this is the thing. I'm already his. I already died It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. My life is not my own. I've been bought with a price, and my life is a living sacrifice. But I'm alive forever with him. I've been made new and I've been made whole. I've been given purpose and love that will never fade, life that will never end. So if that moment comes and I have to make a decision between Jesus or my life, that decision's not going to be made in that moment, because it was made when I decided to follow Jesus. And he is worth dying for. And he is worth living for. We're called to be living sacrifices. Even if we're never brought to that moment, we are living sacrifices. And I hope that in the way we live as a church, as a family, that we live this way. I hope that if Tim or I was ever led away to our death for Jesus, that we'd be like Peter and his wife, cheering each other on to stay courageous and to stand firm. Luke 9:23-26. Then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but you yourself are lost or destroyed? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in his glory and the glory of the Father and the holy angels. Are you ashamed to be a follower of Jesus? Or will you lay down everything and take up your cross, regardless of what anyone else around you thinks, regardless of whose approval you lose? This is what I'm praying for you and all disciples that will be part of our church. To be a disciple means no less than this. If I preached any less than this, I would not be preaching the gospel. Will you take up your cross? Is there anything you care about more than Jesus? Lay it down. It's not worthy of his place in your heart and in your life. Are you all in?